My name is Heidi Marks, and I'm an Associate Dean in the Faculty of Arts and an Associate Professor in the Department of Religion. I was asked by colleagues in the Faculty of Science to help this year with the Robin Connor Lecture Series, and it is my great honor and pleasure to give you a brief introduction to both the series and our esteemed lecturer this year. But first, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji, Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. The Robin Connor Lectureship in the History and Philosophy of Science was established and endowed by Dr. Robin Connor, a former member of the Department of Physics and the former dean, in fact, the first dean of the Faculty of Science when it divided from the Faculty of Arts in 1970. This lecture series is a meaningful way of bringing arts and science back into conversation on a continued basis. Robin Connor was not only a dedicated scientist, researcher, and educator in his field of physics, but he was also avidly interested in the history of science. Sadly, he died in 2017, but before that time, he regularly attended these lectures along with his wife, Dr. Sylvia Connor. She can't be with us this evening, but I understand that his two sons, David and Graham, are here with us, and I welcome them to please stand so we can acknowledge the family by way of acknowledging them. Thank you. Professor Anita Guerrini, our Robin Connor lecturer this year, is the Horning Professor in the Humanities at Oregon State University in Corvallis. She is also a full professor in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion. I have known Anita for 15 years now, since I was a graduate student in history at the University of California at Santa Barbara, where she was teaching at the time. So when Associate Dean Christina Kajensky and Professor Mazdak Kajapur asked if I knew of anyone to invite, she immediately came to mind as a leading researcher in her field and a brilliant and engaging speaker. I credit Anita with having helped to ignite my own passion for the history of ancient medicine, because she arranged for me to teach pre-modern science at UCSB when I was still a graduate student. And that set me on a research path that has proved very rich and gratifying. Anita Guerrini's accomplishments are too vast to digest in a brief introduction. Any 24-page CV is impossible to sort of digest for an audience of this sort. But I do want to give you the following list to give you a sense of her accomplishments. She is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a corresponding member of the International Academy for the History of Science. She's been a senior fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. She's received multiple grants from the National Science Foundation, and if you think NSERC is hard to get a grant from, the National Science Foundation is even harder. She is the author of 4 monographs, all on very different topics, and also the author of 50 articles, or over 50 articles, most of them single-authored. And in the history of science, single-authored is kind of the way to go. The way most of us go the soul and lonely road of single authorship. Her 2015 book, The Courtiers' Anatomists, Animals and Humans in Louis XIV's Paris, was nominated for the American Library and Paris Book Prize. She's with us today and tomorrow to give 2 talks, and I understand that she's presenting us with all new research. So things that are works in progress. And I always personally appreciate it when scholars are brave enough to present new work in public lectures of this sort. Being a researcher myself, this is usually the moment when ideas are most exciting, fresh, and lively. But there's also risks involved with presenting new research. The thing about Anita is that she has so many exciting ideas. She asks the most fascinating and unique questions of her sources, so we should prepare ourselves to be delighted and surprised by her 2 talks. This evening, her talk is entitled Giants, Fossils, and National Identity or Mythology, whichever you prefer, in Modern France. But I also want to welcome you to join us in the Faculty of Arts tomorrow at noon in 409 tier. The room in some of the publications is wrong. It's not 307, it's 409 tier, at our Institute of Humanities, to give a to hear a talk entitled William Hunter and 18th Century Anatomical Collections. So please join me in welcoming Anita to speak to us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Okay. So I have my apparatus here. This is on? Yeah, okay, good. Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you so much to Heidi for asking me. And I'm really honored to be here tonight as the Connor Lecturer, looking at your past lectures. It's like, wow, gee, what a list. So yeah, this this project keeps evolving, so the title keeps evolving. And I realized when I looked at the PowerPoint, and I was like, oh, I gave you a different title. So it's definitely a work in progress, and I welcome your questions and comments afterwards. So let me get started. So, and this illustration is from the 1670s. And the little teeny guy, you could just about see that's an ordinary man. And these are all different varieties of giants to the really giant one that you can see here, and we'll talk about what those were. So on Friday, the 11th of January in 1613, some very large bones were discovered near an ancient castle outside the city of Romans in the Dauphiné in the south of France. So the little pink patch there, you can see the map of the hexagon, and that's the Dauphiné. And I have a link here to a Google map, which will give you a little better idea of where we're talking about. And I will be mentioning the names of some of these towns as I go along. So hopefully this will give you an idea of where we are. So where these bones were found was near the town of Romans-sur-Isère, right there, which is near Grenoble in the Alps. But also this is kind of near Provence. So this is the city of Valence. We'll be hearing about that. There's Lyon. And down here is Marseille. So this gives you kind of an idea of the geography of the area. Can you see Ramon there? Yeah, okay. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So for the next 5 years, a pamphlet war raged over just what or whose bones these were. The very first pamphlet claimed that they were the bones of an ancient Celtic king named Teutobochus, such a great name, one of a race of giants who had been defeated by the Romans in 150 BC. Debates over these bones touched on many issues. On the one hand were scientific and medical questions. Were these bones human? Are giants physically possible? And did they ever exist? How old were these bones? And if they weren't human, what were they? On the other hand was a complex of issues surrounding politics, identity, and history, as well as class and status. The city of Romans had been the site of a particularly vicious urban uprising only 30 years before this discovery in 1580. This was documented by the French historian Emmanuel de Ladourie in his book Carnival at Romans. And the assassination of King Henry IV in 1610 once again revealed religious and political divisions that still festered. And I'll talk more about that a little later. For over a century, humanist historians had sought a pre-Roman, pre-Christian history. And King Teutobochus seemed to be a prime representative of a lost, distinctively Gallic race before its corruption by the Latins or by the Germanic Franks. The real, authentic, and, in the words of Asterix, oh my God, I have to get out of this. Wait a minute. Get out of that. Okay. The irréductible, the unconquerable Gauloise. This debate played itself out not only across France, but across Europe until well into the 18th century. Giants' bones were reportedly found at Stonehenge in 1719. Debates about the nature of the bones continued into the 19th century, and the final determination of their identity only occurred in 1984. So today I'll first describe this discovery and the early response to it, and then address the scientific and historical issues I've just outlined. And I'll close with the decline of giants and the modern identification of the bones. So first let's talk about the giant himself. Now, a guy named Jacques Tissot, and we don't know any more about him, announced the discovery within a few weeks in a 15-page pamphlet published in Lyon and subsequently republished in many places, translated into English, It was very, very well known at the time. So according to this account, some miners at a sand quarry at the Chateau de Chaumont, the estate of the Marquis de Langon, had unearthed a 30-foot-long brick tomb. Within the tomb were bones that apparently belonged to a giant. It was some 25 feet long. On the tomb was a stone inscribed with a name, Teutobochus Rex, the legendary king of the Cimbri and the Teutons, who had been defeated by the Roman consul Marius in 150 BC. Medals and coins bearing the insignia of Marius scattered around the tomb made the identity certain. Now, this is probably the kind of thing that you were meant to imagine when you were reading these pamphlets. This is an illustration from a book on antiquities from 1612, just a year earlier. And you can see the skeletons, the kind of tombstone with a date on it, markings in Latin, coins. So this is what you were meant to imagine was actually there. This is not what was actually there, as we'll see. Tissot was not heard from again. The discovery and the human identity of the bones had been affirmed by a local surgeon named Pierre Mazouillet, who in the summer of 1613 transported most of the bones, but not the tomb, and the tomb will come back to haunt us, transported most of the bones to Paris to be shown to the king. Now, the king was Louis XIII, and he was 12 years old. And he thought this was just the coolest thing ever. He declared, any 12-year-old boy, it's like, giants, cool, God, this is great. So here's Louis XIII. He declared himself astonished and mystified by the bones, and he did not doubt that they were human. So now we have royal approbation. So it's like the king said they were really giants, must be really a giant. With this royal approbation, Mazouillet exhibited the bones all over Paris. He had a big tent which was painted with an image of King Teutobochus, and he set it up in the middle of Paris, and people came to see the bones. Now, the Paris surgeon Nicolas Abicot viewed the bones and threw down the gauntlet in what became a pamphlet war. And this is Abicot. In gigantosteology, meaning the science of bones of giants, basically, published in September 1613, Abicot made several claims. The first was that giants once existed, and their existence was and remained anatomically and physiologically possible, even such enormous giants as this one. Abicot argued primarily from anatomy, displaying his expertise as a surgeon and anatomist. Now, a complete skeleton had not been found, but parts, including 2 mandibles with some teeth, a couple of vertebrae, what seemed to be a sternum, a breastbone, a shoulder blade, the heel and instep of a foot, the top of a humerus, and the prize, a very long tibia, a very long leg bone. Concluding that these were indeed human bones of a giant some 25 feet tall, Abicot went on to give examples of other giants in the past, citing the Roman author Pliny, whose account in his first century natural history of a 50-foot Greek giant, and the legendary 30-foot tall giant Farragut, supposedly killed by Roland during the reign of Charlemagne. Such giants, Abicot argued, were still possible. Female anatomy, he said, could expand to hold an enormous fetus. Women are very elastic. Citing the semi-legendary Margaretha von Henneberg, a Dutch noblewoman who it was said gave birth to 363 babies at the same time in 1308. He got a few details wrong. There was actually 365 babies in 1276. We now think, and this is a 17th century representation of this. Yes. And this little basin here is what the babies, supposed babies, are in. This is now thought that she had a certain kind of uterine cyst, or, well, many of them. Abicot also found in the works of the eminent French surgeon Ambroise Paré the somewhat more plausible story, not much more plausible, of a certain Dorothea who gave birth to 20 living children over 2 pregnancies. Whether 8 and 12 or 9 and 11 is not clear. But this image of the kind of monstrously expanded woman was reproduced many times and was used to argue that, indeed, an ordinary-sized woman could give birth to a really big giant. Abico also cited historical accounts, in particular the 2nd century history of Rome, written by a guy named Publius Annius Florus, which had been translated into French in 1580. Florus described a bloody battle near Aix-en-Provence, where the consul Marius defeated the king of the Teutons, Teutobochus, whom he described as being marvelously tall. Abico therefore laid out his argument thus. King Teutobochus existed. He was known to have been of exceptional stature. The battle between the king and Marius was well documented by ancient historians. The bones found in the tomb were indubitably human, if exceptionally large. Therefore, the bones were those of King Teutobochus, QED. Abico dedicated his 60-page work to the young king and prefaced it with pages of dedicatory poems and epigrams in French, Latin, and Greek, in the style of many humanist works of scholarship of his time. There are always all these dedicatory poems. You get your friends to write poems saying what a great guy you are, and he had all of this stuff. It touched off a firestorm of criticism over the next 5 years with at least a dozen pamphlets. Abico wrote this work to get attention, and he certainly did. He described himself on the title page as the master maître chirurgien juré de l'Université de Paris, a master licensed surgeon of the University of Paris, a fully credentialed surgeon, a member of the Surgeons College at Saint-Côme. He had obtained this title only recently, however. Until a few years earlier, Abico had been not a credentialed surgeon, but merely a barber. He took the exam for the Surgeons College at Saint-Côme. He swore an oath to ôter les bassins, that is, to remove the basins that barbers would carry with them for bleeding, because that's what barbers did. They would bleed people to relieve fevers and other things. So he swore to throw away his basins. Fiercely ambitious, he had written a best-selling guide to dissection called the Anatomical Week, La Semaine Anatomique, in 1610. Gigantostéologie, with its extravagant display of both anatomical and humanistic learning, showed that he had arrived. He was the real thing. His knowledge of human anatomy and dissection, he claimed, made him the perfect person to assess the anatomical questions of gigantism and the human character of the bones. Human giants existed, and this was a giant. His humanist knowledge of history, lots of Latin quotes, not all of them totally apropos, made him the ideal interpreter of these bones' significance. He closed his little book with a singularly apt quotation from Virgil's Aeneid. But Abico was not allowed to rest on his laurels for long. A few months later, yet another pamphlet appeared, this one anonymous, although everyone knew who had written it. The very anodyne title page, as you see here, of Gigantomachie, gave little indication of the attack that lay therein. The author, who described himself as a scholar of medicine, declared Gigantostéologie to be full of errors of ignorance, inept in language, in the worst French. The orthography is ridiculous. The discourse of anatomy is totally false and shows a great ignorance of anatomy. And that's just the first page. Even the quote from the Aeneid was wrong. It was misquoted. And it wasn't even from the Aeneid. It was from the Georgics, which is another poem by Virgil. Abico obviously did not know Latin, which is a mark of distinction between a physician and a surgeon, but also between a barber and a licensed surgeon. He was supposed to know Latin. And this author claims he cited only anatomists that had written in or had been translated into French, so he was a fraud. The author of this and several other anti-Abico pamphlets over the next few years was this guy, the physician Jean Rioland the Younger. If Abico was a self-made man, earning success in Paris for his surgical skills, Rioland was a product of one of the most entrenched systems of patronage and privilege in France, the Paris Faculty of Medicine. His father, also named Jean Rioland, had been a dean of a faculty that was notoriously nepotistic. If you look through the roles of the deans and the members of the Paris faculty, the same names repeat themselves over and over and over. It was also notoriously conservative in its medical philosophy, supporting the theories of the Greek Hippocrates and the Roman Galen. Its members were particularly skeptical of the new chemical Paracelsian medicine, which was becoming very popular. Rioland the Younger was showered with positions and honors as soon as he obtained his MD degree in 1605, with a lucrative lectureship at the Collège Royal, which is now known as the Collège de France, that apparently did not require delivering any lectures. We should all be so lucky. And an equally lucrative medical practice, soon including an appointment as physician to the Queen Mother Marie de' Medici. But despite these advantages, Rioland was equally, if not more, ambitious than Abico. Although he benefited from his father's connections, he also pursued the new anatomical knowledge that had begun to emerge in the 16th century with this guy, Vesalius, very famous title page of his work De Fabrica from 1543. And this is Vesalius, the first time someone had included a self-portrait on the title page of their work, which shows you what Vesalius thought of himself. So, and shows himself dissecting. This is one of the most famous title pages in the history of medicine. Physicians' training included witnessing a dissection, but not necessarily participating themselves. So they would witness someone like a dissection like this. People would be all crowded around looking at it. It would happen once in your career. Rioland the Younger learned to dissect from private lessons with surgeons, and he even set himself up as an independent anatomy instructor around 1614, so actually rivaling the surgeons. So let me move on now to physical and textual arguments. I'm not going to take time to go through all of the pamphlets, as I'm sure you're relieved to hear. What I want to talk about is what was at stake. Why was Rioland so excited, so exercised about Abico? Why did it matter to him? What did it mean if the bones were or were not King Teutobochus? Abico and Rioland had fundamentally different visions of the scientific and historical issues. But their differences did not fall neatly into identifiable categories. It wasn't kind of ancient versus modern, for example. And some, but not all of their animosity can be traced to their differing social and professional status. Now, Rioland is best known today, if he's known at all, as the antagonist of William Harvey over the theory of the circulation of the blood, first published in 1628 in this work known as De Motu Cordis, on the motion of the heart. Rioland never accepted the circulation of the blood, and since he was very powerful in the Paris Faculty of Medicine, the Paris Faculty of Medicine never accepted the circulation of the blood until after Rioland died. So the first thesis that defended the circulation came 5 years after Rioland had died. He wouldn't allow it. But in 1613, Rioland presents himself as a man of the new science, combating superstition as well as, ineptitude. But so does Abico. Although in addition, both men would call themselves humanists, would call themselves scholars of the classics. They employed ancient texts in very different ways, and as a result, they also presented differing visions of the emerging French nation. Was the France of Louis XIII to reincarnate ancient Rome or ancient Gaul? Rioland's first pamphlet argued mainly from anatomy, making the debate largely a professional contest over whose anatomical skills were better. And he cited Abico's Semaine anatomique as much as Gigantostéologie to argue that these bones were not human. But he also disputed the idea that extra-large giants such as Teutobochus had ever existed. This latter topic had been much discussed in the 16th century. The humanist so-called historian and notorious forger, a guy named Gianni Nanni, who is known as Annius of Viterbo, claimed he quoted an ancient Babylonian historian called Berosus, which he had totally invented. And he postulated two distinct races of giants, those before and after the biblical deluge. Now, Annius of Viterbo's work was incredibly popular, literally hundreds of editions. He was, I don't even know what to compare him to, but he was extremely popular. He claimed he was kind of channeling this ancient Babylonian historian. So this was all the real pre-Christian, pre-Roman truth about everything. So, and he said there were two races of giants before the deluge, after the deluge. The first race included Noah. Noah was a giant. And they were monstrous both in size and in behavior. The Frenchman Jean Lemaire took up this theme in a work called Illustrations de Gaul, Illustrations of Gaul. And these was also hugely popular. There are many editions of that, where he proposed a lineage of Gaulish kings dating back to that giant Noah. As the earth aged, he argued, these kings grew smaller. So we are shrinking. We're not as good as the ancients. The poet Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel in the 1530s satirized the stories of Lemaire and Annius. And in a later pamphlet, Riolan upbraided Abico for forgetting to include Gargantua. Since he had included other evidence from tales and poets, why doesn't he include fictional giants? What the heck? European savants took the argument of the Earth's senescence and decline in different ways. In 1555, the Paris anatomist Jacques Dubois, known as Sylvius, argued against Vesalius that the human body had in fact changed since antiquity. Vesalius had argued, among other things, that Galen's observations were erroneous, the ancient Roman physician Galen, because he mostly based his observations on animals. And Dubois says, no, Galen was right, but humans were different back then. They were bigger, they were just different. So Sylvius concludes that Galen's observations were not actually wrong. He says the ancients were bigger and therefore his observations were accurate for the people he had at the time. The Italian scholar Girolamo Maggi, better known for his works on fortifications and bells, but also wrote about giants. He postulated in 1563 in a work called The Lives of Famous Men that one could conceivably measure the age of the Earth by this diminution in size. In other words, if you knew how big Noah was, you could tell how long ago he actually lived. This was a slightly dangerous thing to be talking about, since there were some pretty standard estimates of how old the world was. And he was saying, well, actually, if we're going to judge the age of the Earth by this kind of diminution over the generations in the size of people, this could be a much longer time than we thought. And this is one of the reasons he ends up rejecting the idea that giants could have existed, because it just kind of edged into dangerous theological territory. But extending the arguments of Maggi, a Flemish physician named Jan van Gorp, known as Goropius, set out to demolish the whole idea of giants. And this is part of his history of the origins of Antwerp. He has an essay called Gigantomachia, in 1569. He argues from medical and anatomical theory that giants were physically and logically impossible. And from philology, which was a very popular thing for humanists to argue from studying language itself, he further argued that the term describing giants in the Bible did not refer to their size, it referred to their temperament. Far from being in decline, he said modern humans were far more robust than the ancients. Very big humans, 7 or 8 feet tall, could exist, but 30-foot giants were totally a myth. So Riolan cites Goropius in Gigantomachie. But, of course, Goropius is also refuted. A Huguenot Protestant polemicist named Jean Chassaignon had answered Goropius in a work called De Gigantibus, of giants, in 1580, returning to biblical and literary evidence of the existence of giants. He argued that if we can accept that the patriarchs lived extraordinarily long lives, why can't we accept that they were physically larger as well? And I just a couple months ago, I read a manuscript description of a giant that was found in Macedonia in 1691. And this manuscript description was written by a monk. And he argued that, well, if the patriarchs lived like 900 years, then they had a lot of time to kind of cook their reproductive fluids. So that would make it more powerful, and therefore they could certainly give birth to giants. So he's trying to give this kind of physiological explanation, because, you know, if Methuselah lived to be like 900, then his sperm must have been really powerful. So, yeah, anyways. I had not seen that argument before. I thought that was a pretty good one. So Chassaignon cited several giants whose bones had been found in France, testifying to the former greatness in every way of the Gauls. Abico's arguments closely followed those of Chassaignon. And I wish I knew if Abico was a Protestant, because that would kind of make him a much more interesting character in some ways. He could have been, but I don't know if he was. But Abico did not make the argument that everyone in the distant past was a giant, just some people, and that they continued to be possible. So thus far as we see, physical, theological, and textual arguments are closely intertwined. Riolan argues he's a better anatomist, but he's also a better humanist. He's also a better scholar. But even though he, like his predecessor Sylvius, was a staunch believer in Galen as the be-all and end-all of medicine, he did not agree with this notion of human decline. Riolan believed that Vesalius was a self-advertising charlatan who probably vivisected humans when he got the chance. He really hated Vesalius, even though Vesalius was, had been dead for 50 years at this point. But he conceded that at least some of Vesalius's refutations of Galen's anatomy were correct. And Riolan did not argue that human bodies had substantially changed since antiquity. He was much too good an anatomist for that. So again, you can't kind of divide these arguments into one side against the other because they're kind of arguing past each other in some ways. The similarly self-advertising Abico is to Riolan both wrong and presumptuous because he is barely a step away from being a barber. Even a fellow surgeon in another pamphlet attacked Abico for being low class. So much for professional solidarity. But the theological arguments also do not neatly follow these divisions. Abico closely follows Chassaignon's arguments and citations, but he barely mentioned the notion of decline. As the historian Jean Sayard has noted, Chassaignon's arguments attempted to straddle two contradictory positions. As a good Calvinist, he wished to emphasize the free will of God to do whatever he wanted. He could create giants, he could create dwarfs, he could do whatever he wanted at any time. But the notion of decline implied that God's creation was imperfect and that the creativity of nature was limited, perhaps even nearing its end, as the world aged and man diminished in size, a process apparently outside God's intervention. It just happens. Moreover, Maggi had recognized that the very long time frame required for a gradual reduction in height from, say, 30 feet or more to the average height for his time came uncomfortably close to Aristotle's claim that time was infinite and that the earth was uncreated and eternal, a doctrine, of course, strictly forbidden by the Catholic Church and indeed by the Bible. So let's move on to paleontology. Abico and Riolan saw the bones on display in Paris, but drew differing conclusions from their physical appearance. Abico claimed they looked like bones, white and polished. Certainly polished white bones were the ideal among anatomists when they constructed skeletons. The comments of many anatomical authors in these matters emphasized whiteness and smoothness as desirable qualities and gave detailed instructions on how to attain this. Riolan countered that the bones were not really white. They were kind of grayish. And they didn't have the texture of bones at all. They seemed more like stones. Moreover, if they were bones, and they had indeed been enclosed in a brick tomb, why were some reduced to dust while others were intact? Riolan found the selection of bones to be highly suspicious, noting that only the bones that most resembled the human miraculously seemed to have survived. Moreover, he said the leg bones seemed to have consisted of several pieces glued together. He clearly suspected that the surgeon Mazouillet, the guy who originally attested to these being human, and he says Mazouillet still carries his basins around, so he's only a barber. Mazouillet was not to be trusted. Following Goropius, Riolan argued both in Gigantomachie and his last contribution to the debate, we're skipping forward to 1518, Gigantologie, he argued that these were not human bones at all, but those of an animal, most likely an elephant. He freely admitted that he had never seen an elephant, nor had Abico. The first elephant to appear in Europe for almost a century passed through Paris in 1631. The last one was in the 1550s. But reverting to his humanist background at the Paris Faculty of Medicine rather than to the new empiricism, Riolan told Abico that he could prove that the bones were of an elephant because he knew the ancient authorities better, not because he had actually seen an elephant. Aristotle and the Roman naturalist Aelian, as well as the 16th century French naturalist Pierre Gilles, who had translated Aelian from Greek into Latin, they had all written about elephants and described them in detail, so he knew what an elephant looked like. More recently, the naturalists Gessner and Aldrovandi had each included elephants in their compendia of natural history, and with remarkably similar illustrations. And the German Lutheran pastor Joachim Pretorius had published an entire book on elephants in 1607. He also had never actually seen one. But how did the bones of an elephant get to the Dauphiné? Some said Riolan attributed this to Hannibal, although Roman was a little off his route, not really that close to the Alps. Riolan repeated the claim of Goropius that one or two of these made their way to Flanders. Remember, Goropius is talking about the foundation of Antwerp, which was supposedly by a giant. So Goropius is arguing that the bones of the supposed Antwerp giant were actually the bones of elephants that had somehow wandered up there. Riolan was not convinced by that argument either and fell back on what seemed to him to be a much more likely story, that the earth engendered these bone-like rocks itself. 50 years earlier, the great Swiss naturalist Conrad Gessner, same guy who does this picture of the elephant, had published a small book called De Omni Rerum Fossilium, of all fossil things. As the historian Martin Rudwick has explained in his book, The Meaning of Fossils, fossils in this period were anything that was dug up from the earth, including precious stones, ores, and rocks. Gessner's was one of the first works to illustrate what we would call fossils, that is, organic remains. And he could not figure these out. He had huge difficulty in identifying similarities between what we call fossils and organic objects, particularly those that did not resemble currently living objects. What do you do with something like an ammonite? What do you do with a giant shark's tooth? It looks like a shark's tooth, but it's like 10 times bigger. What do you do with that? As Galileo's friend Federico Chesi pointed out, these cases were problematic because they participated in more than one class of things, in this case animal and mineral, which by the rules of the great chain of being was impossible. You couldn't have something that was both animal and mineral. It was one or the other. So these things looked like animals, but were they really animals? This middle nature made fossils a topic of fascination, but also, again, of great caution. Now, Gessner didn't speculate as to the cause of these. He just described these. In the 16th century, two general causes were advanced for such objects. One, which we might call Renaissance naturalism, was particularly promoted by Paracelsus and his followers, who were alchemists. He claimed that these are natural resemblances that nature creates as part of a system of correspondences. Paracelsian nature is shot through with hidden meanings and correspondences between living and non-living, microcosm and macrocosm, which the diligent physician-philosopher can discover, particularly through alchemical practices. Aristotle, in contrast, believed that fossils, in both the ancient and the modern sense, grew in the earth and therefore could be replenished over time. One could see this process in stalactites and stalagmites and also in crystals. They did grow. On this, the Paracelsians and the Aristotelians were actually in agreement. But rather than mystic affinities, Aristotelians argued that some particularly lifelike objects are the result of seeds that grow in the earth rather than above it. So fossils that look like fish are created from the seed of fish that provided the form. Remember, Aristotle talks about the form and then the material. But the stony stuff of the earth provided the matter rather than another fish. So you end up with a stone that looks like a fish, but it isn't. Others, like ammonites that had no modern correlate, were simply coincidental. It just happened to look like something that had once been alive. The idea that any of these were the remains of once living animals was just not on the map, not conceivable at this point. Riolan reported that Gessner found fossil teeth that could never have belonged to any animal. And so he found it much more probable to believe, as in fact Gessner believed, that these simply grew in the earth. Riolan said, if our body can engender bones, stones, wood, gold, why can't the earth, our common mother, which contains in it the seeds of all things, engender and form stones resembling human bones? We don't need the execrable impiety, the impudence and temerity of the alchemists to explain that. The bones from the Dauphiné then resembled an elephant more than a man, but in fact came from neither. In his Anti-Gigantologie, the last riposte in the debate, Abiko denied that the bones were monstrous or prodigious or came from a whale or an elephant, and even less are they fossils or mixed substances, that is, both animal and mineral. Thus, they are truly human bones. So eliminate all the other variables, they gotta be human. But he didn't counter Riolan's account that stones grew in the earth. It was a commonly held belief. Nor did he offer any new evidence other than testimonials from the Marquis de Langon and the Surgeon Mazier, who of course had kind of vested interests in the bones being those of Tuta Bocas. So now let's turn briefly to history. As humanists, both Riolan and Abiko relied heavily on their knowledge of ancient history. Riolan, who was much better educated than Abiko, could rely on a broader array of sources. But in addition, their self-presentation as experts differed. This reflected not only their levels of expertise, but also their attitude toward the past. This was in part a generational difference. Abiko was born in 1550, Riolan was born in 1580. They were a generation apart. But it was also very much a function of their differing social standing. And again, we see no neat division of old versus new. Riolan was a contemporary of a guy named Nicolas Fabry de Peiresc, who was a jurist and antiquarian and naturalist in Aix-en-Provence. They were actually born in the same year. And they shared similar views of the past and its function. To Peiresc, the past, like the new science, was the domain of experts who defined what is true and what is false, based particularly on analysis of things as well as analysis of texts. Peiresc was a prodigious collector, and he sought what he called the most beautiful singularities, as much of nature as of antiquity, so that these are somehow both on the same level. He collects natural objects, he collects coins and other ancient objects. According to his biographer, the natural philosopher Pierre Gassendi, Peiresc heard about the Dauphiné giant almost as soon as it had been dug up. It was, after all, not far away from him in Aix. He was not unwilling to believe that this was a human giant, although the size claimed for it seemed extreme. But his knowledge of antiquities led him to question the details of the story. Why would Teutons inscribe a tomb in Latin? Why would the Romans build a tomb for an enemy? If they did so, Peiresc explained, it would not have been of brick, which the Romans never employed, but of marble. And it would have the details of the battle portrayed on its sides, as Roman sarcophagi did. Why would you build a tomb in a sandpit? Gassendi pointed out that the tomb itself and its conveniently inscribed stone had somehow disappeared and had not accompanied the bones to Paris. And this too added to Peiresk's skepticism about the authenticity of the bones. But I do want to add that recent work has added some credibility, actually, to the existence of a tomb. The paleontologist Leonard Ginsberg, whom we'll hear more about in a minute, noted in 1984 that the red striated earth surrounding the bones did resemble bricks and could have been mistaken for the remains of a brick tomb by the guys who originally found it. And the classicist Adrian Mayer has pointed out that ancient people sometimes reburied giant fossils in tombs because they believed the fossils were the bones of ancient heroes. So both of these enter possibilities that there actually was a tomb, but nonetheless, no one ever saw it except the first two guys who looked at it. Abiko had placed much emphasis on the coins or medals that had been found around the tomb. They were the only thing that he chose to illustrate. I have not found any images of the bones themselves. And he copied it from Tissot. And here are the pictures of the coins. And the French and English versions of this look slightly different. He and Tissot, that is Abico and Tissot, claimed that the initials on the coins were those of Marius. Peiresc argued that this could not possibly be the case for several reasons. Marius's name was actually Caius Marius. The Caius would not have been omitted. And indeed, Marius would not have been abbreviated to MA if indeed that's what that says, which is extremely unclear. Peiresc found it more likely that the coins originated in Marseille, Massilia in Latin, and that the MA denoted that city, that they were just coins that had been minted in Marseille and somehow ended up there. Riolan did not employ such learned evidence. This is Peiresc who is arguing this about the coins. Instead, Riolan just wondered why Marius would have bothered throwing the coins in after he had gone to the trouble of making the tomb. But since no one had actually seen the coins, other than their discoverers, this too remained mysterious. Just have a drink here. If Riolan and Peiresc adopted the persona of the expert who distinguished the true from the false based on evidence, either empirical or textual, Abico recalls to us an earlier variety of humanist. In the 14th century, the poet Petrarch did not merely want to study the ancients, he wanted to be one. He wanted to reframe the present so he could restore the past. His relationship to antiquity was direct and emotional. And I believe Abico adopted a similar relationship to the past, but with a difference. Between Petrarch and the early 17th century had appeared those new histories of Europe that harked back to a pre-Roman, pre-Greek, pre-Christian age. Petrarch wanted to be a Roman. Abico wanted to be a Gaul. Annius of Viterbo and others outlined a political history that paralleled the intellectual histories being developed by Pico della Mirandola and others that look back to the kind of ancient wisdom of such mythical figures as Hermes Trismegistus, who was supposed to be an ancient Egyptian. In both cases, the protagonists were larger than life, possessors of a purer, more noble character and knowledge than even the Greeks. So it's not coincidental that the Gaulish past underwent a revival in the 16th century. As the archaeologist Alain Schnapp has written, from the 16th century onwards, the history of the Gauls was an ideological matter. But the ideological meanings were quite unstable. Borrowing heavily from Annius of Viterbo, Jean Lemaire wrote his Illustration du Gaul between 1507 and 1510 for his patron, Marguerite of Austria, the Habsburg regent of the Netherlands, making an argument for the antiquity of a Gaul that encompassed and was ruled by the old kingdom of Burgundy. That is, by Marguerite's family. He's writing this for his patron. He's saying, this is what ancient Gaul was, it's Burgundy, this is your territory. But in 1511, Lemaire changed jobs, and he became the court historian for the King of France. And Gaul took on a rather different meaning, one that persisted over many reprintings of the Illustration over the course of the 16th century. This Gaul was identified with France, not with Burgundy, and the Gauls superseded the Franks as the true ancestors of the French people. The Franks came after the Romans. The Gauls came before them. Caesar's Gallic Wars, describing his battles against the Gauls in the 1st century before our era, enjoyed numerous editions, and the poets Ronsard and Du Bellay each wrote poems about the Gauls, not about the Franks. Du Bellay also wrote a substantial prose work on the antiquity of the Gauls in France, citing a long list of classical authors who had attested to the existence of the Gauls in ancient times. Now, the French underwent a civil war during much of the second half of the 16th century, ending with Henry IV's assumption of the throne in 1589. Now, Henry assumed that the civil war was over religion, was between Catholics and Protestants. And Henry IV, who was the heir, but he was a Protestant, he converted to Catholicism in order to assume the throne. He said famously, Paris is worth a mass. The image of a Gaul that was pacified by Caesar and fully Romanized continued to appeal to governing Catholics, but a more disruptive image of the Gauls as resisting Roman domination, even as republicans, emerged alongside, via authors such as the humanist reformer Pierre de la Ramée, better known as Ramus. The riot in the city of Romans pitted the kind of what were called the menu peuple, the smaller people, against the wealthy patricians, who slaughtered their opponents and were rewarded by the Catholic crown. Less than a decade after the so-called Carnival in Romans, which took place in 1580, Henry IV attempted to heal these divisions of class and religion. But his assassination by a Catholic fanatic in 1610 indicated that old passions did not die easily. So to Abico, Tutor Bocchus represented a point of continuity between the Gaulish past and the present. His own status as an upstart, I think, certainly explains some of the appeal of a giant Gaul fighting the Romans, one so formidable that his enemies cannot but honor him in death. There had been few material remains that might support this story, so the discovery of the bones of Tutor Bocchus was fortuitous, to say the least. Unfortunately for Abico, Riolan saw through this scheme, and his superior knowledge of ancient history allowed him to demolish Abico's dreams of an irréductible Gaulois that might disrupt the present status quo, which of course Riolan very much did not want to disrupt. He was profiting very well, thank you very much, from the status quo. In fact, said Riolan, Tutor Bocchus was not a Gaul at all. As Florus had clearly stated, he was a Teuton. That is, a member of a Germanic tribe closer to the Franks than to the Gauls. His tribe originated in what was now Zurich in Switzerland, not anywhere near France. He may never have set foot in the Dauphiné, let alone anywhere else in France. Moreover, the battle Florus described between Marius and Tutor Bocchus, according to Riolan, took place in Tuscany, not in France at all. And the king was brought to Rome as a prize of war before being executed. So Riolan says, how on earth could he have ended up buried near Romans, hundreds of leagues from either Rome or Zurich? What's he doing here? Okay. Abico replied to Riolan in Anti-Gigantology, as we have seen, simply repeating his earlier arguments. Riolan did not deign to reply, and the pamphlet war ended in 1618. But the debates about giants did not. Now, in this illustration from William Camden's Britannia, which first published in 1586, this is from the 1637 edition. I'm sorry, the reproduction's not very good. But here you can see, this is obviously a view of Stonehenge. You can see here there are people digging up very large bones in this little kind of vignette. So this grave near Stonehenge appears to contain giants' bones, and Camden speculated about giant pre-Roman Britons. In the 1630s, Pallas charged his man in Sicily to investigate stories of a giant dug up near Palermo. There were lots of giants dug up near Palermo. It's a huge site for Miocene fossils. Reports of giants' bones continued to appear throughout the 17th century and into the 18th. Here's one newspaper report from 1718 that notes that the bones of a giant, although 9 feet long rather than 25, had indeed been dug up at Stonehenge and were on exhibit in London, if you can't quite read this. Whereas one of the burrows near the famous Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain was lately leveled, and very deep within the said burrow, or burying place, was found an entire human skeleton of an unusual size, the length thereof measuring full 9 foot 4 inches. These are therefore to advertise any curious person or persons who may be inclined to purchase the said rarity, that it will very soon be brought to town and lodged at the Duke of Marlborough's Head in Fleet Street, that is at a tavern, and shall remain there some time before it is exposed to public view. So in other words, if you want to get in and actually buy this, and you bet the profit from exhibiting us, we got this for you. So. But the physician antiquary William Stukeley's 1740 study of Stonehenge did not mention giants, although it did mention druids, a connection that had also been made to the Gauls in the 16th century. They weren't druids. Meanwhile, in his 1661 History of the Dauphiné, the historian Nicolas Croyer described Teutobochus as a hero of the battles between the Teutons and the Romans, but never mentioned his height. However, he identified the site of the battle as Valence, who is fairly close to Rouen. By the end of the 18th century, the notion of ancient giants had faded. As archaeology and paleontology developed into sciences, new discoveries complicated and extended the literary descriptions of the past. At the same time, the biblical time frame that had made fossils so difficult to identify began to disintegrate, and the idea of extinction was no longer beyond belief. We'll hear a little more about that tomorrow. Both Riordan and Peiresc noted the resemblance of the bones of Teutobochus to those of an elephant, but could not explain very well how an elephant came to be in the Dauphiné. The pioneering paleontologist Georges Cuvier declared the bones to be those of an extinct mammoth around 1800. Here's a reconstructed skeleton of a Siberian mammoth from around that time. 30 years later, and here's Cuvier's reconstruction of the mastodon, Cuvier's successor at the Paris Museum of Natural History, Henri de Blainville, further identified them as belonging to a mastodon, a different species. But only in 1984 was a definitive identification made. Paleontologist Leonard Ginsberg analyzed the cast of a tooth that he found in the storage in the Paris Museum of Natural History, and believe it or not, it was marked Teutobochus. So he finds this cast of this kind of elephantine tooth. He declared it to be the tooth of a Miocene mammal known as Dinotherium, but the biggest of the prehistoric elephant species. The site where the skeleton had been found 400 years ago was quite rich in prehistoric mammals. Now, the character of the irréductible Gaulois, of course, survives in the wildly popular cartoon character of Asterix. And yes, that is Gérard Depardieu. There was a live-action movie of Asterix about close to 20 years ago, and Gérard Depardieu plays Obelix, who is the kind of giant who carries the menhirs around. You can see. He was like born to play it, what can I say? Asterix first appeared in 1959, another turning point in French history. In the previous year, the Fourth Republic had fallen, and the Fifth Republic, headed by the hero of the resistance, Charles de Gaulle, had come into being. France was riven by decolonization, and especially by the Algerian War, which went on for several years longer. The character of Asterix satirized current politics. The character of Caesar looks an awful lot like de Gaulle, but also reinforced an image of the essential character of the post-revolutionary French people: secular, republican, and rational. Asterix gained superhuman strength from a magic potion brewed by the druid Panoramix, although his sidekick Obelix, having been exposed to the potion at birth, did not need to imbibe it. But he outsmarted the Romans even without the potion. So again, we have this image of the Gaul, who is like the quintessential Frenchman. We like to think of science as being immune from the vagaries of politics, even though we know that's never the case. The bones of Teutobochus show us that science can serve to uphold any number of myths, and that there is no single truth. It also shows that myths, as we know, help to make a community and a nation. And one final image. The Gaulois with the Gaulish helmet. So, thank you very much.